Let's begin our exploration of evolutionary genetics. So we'll begin with microevolution, and this is in contrast to macroevolution. So as with a lot of things we talked about this semester, pay attention to the prefixes. So micro as in small and macro as in large, and microevolution usually leads to macroevolution. So microevolution are talking about really small changes, as small as a single base pair. So, and this is in the genes, and we know that the genes are going to dictate the phenotype of our organisms in our population. So essentially, changes in this gene pool is what microevolution is talking about. And then how does that then change over generations? And then how would that gene pool affect the phenotype and reproductive success of our populations? So factors that contribute is one, mutations. So mutations introduce new genetic variation. And then there are also mechanisms that act on existing variations. So natural selection, genetic drift, migration, and non-random mating. In this video, we're going to cover natural selection. In the next video, we'll cover the rest of them. So let's get started. So with natural selection, I'm sure you've heard of it, and you've heard of it as survival of the fittest, right? And people automatically assume that fittest is actually physical fitness, but in this case, we're talking about reproductive fitness, okay? So this idea was put forth by Darwin and Wallace independently in the 1850s, although Darwin is largely given the credit. And for years, when we thought about it, we thought about the four principles that play on natural selection. So there's some variation. So you have a population, and there's a variation within it. So in this case, the color of the moths. Now, there's a struggle to survive. That struggle can be in the form of how much food is available. If there is the niche, like what's there? Is there enough room? Is there enough mates available? So in this case, it could be predation too. Okay, so there's something out to eat them. And the fitness is those who are most fit for their environment survive. So here we're looking at actually the environment, a tree, and can they camouflage? And so depending on the color of the tree, it dictates which one blends in. So in some environments, to be lighter is more beneficial, whereas in other environments, to be darker is more beneficial. And then what happens is over time, because let's say the light ones get picked off, the birds just keep eating them and eating them. Over time, this population in this environment tend to be darker, and the reverse will happen in the lighter environment. Okay, so survival of the fittest with respect to reproductive success. We can also look at that in giraffes. Like once upon a time, giraffes were born and they had necks of varying lengths. There was a struggle because the lower the food is, the more they can reach it, they will eat it and it will be gone. And the higher branches then would remain, and only those who had longer necks could reach it, right? And so then over time, those who couldn't reach the food couldn't eat, and they would die out. And those who could reach the food would then be more successful because they are there. They will reproduce with those like them, and over time, all giraffes would have longer necks, right? Now, since then, and since we've learned so much about molecular genetics, there's a push to update the natural selection requirements, okay? So one is saying this allelic variation arises in various ways like mutations, okay? So there's variation, but now it's saying not just at the phenotypic level, but at the molecular level, we know that there's these mutations. And those mutations can create new alleles, and we know that a gene encodes for a protein, and then that protein has a function. And so now we're having these mutations and this variation that's giving us the allelic change, so the genetic sequence change, the protein change. Then those alleles might encode proteins that enhance survival or reproduction. And so I know I said that fitness is not physical fitness. However, those who survive are those who multiply. And so then the individuals with those beneficial alleles reproduce and contribute. Okay, so now that gene pool is going to be dominated by those who survive. And those who survive are those that have the beneficial traits. And then over time, many generations, those allele frequencies begin to shift due to natural selection. Okay, so like with the giraffes, those of shorter length, they die out. Those with the longer ones are reproducing more and more. And so the shorter ones, their genes are being removed from the population and it's being replaced by those with longer necks. Okay, so same idea, but now we're looking at it at the molecular level as opposed to the organism. Now, within natural selection, there are different types. Okay, so there are 4 different types to think about. And remember, we are still talking about mostly like phenotype because it's something we can easily recognize. So there's directional selection. Now, this is going to favor those extremes. So when we look back at the moths, we are going dark to light. We're not considering the things that could be in the middle of it. Okay, so in one population, the lighter extreme wins, and the other one, the darker extreme. Okay. And so again, directional selection favors the extreme phenotype, and it usually depends on an environment. So in one environment, it's those who are very light, whereas in the other environment, it's those who are very dark. Balance in selection might be a little tricky, but essentially the alleles are both favored, okay? Like those alleles are all maintained. And so you reach this equilibrium of sorts, where one is not better than the other. Okay, where they both are maintained. And then there are 2 ways to get this. So the heterozygous advantage that we've talked about before, and then this negative frequency dependent selection. It's a mouthful, right? So with the heterozygous advantage, think back to sickle cell and malaria. Now, because sickle cell can be so detrimental to individuals, it was hypothesized that it would be removed from our communities. However, in areas that we know they have high incidence of malaria, sickle cell prevails. Okay, and because we're talking about those heterozygous have the advantage, each heterozygote carries 1 dominant, 1 recessive trait, balancing each other out. Okay, so each time you have a heterozygous individual, you're introducing 1 of each trait, and so in the end you have equal number of dominant and recessive traits. Now, the negative frequency dependent selection gets to be a little tricky. And the idea is that the fitness of the genotype decreases when its frequency increases. Okay, so that's the negative part where we are moving in opposite directions. And the example given is on this elderflower orchid. And it's said that you have both yellow and red. And then they both have pollinators, bumblebees, okay, 2 different species. And that those pollinators increase their visit to the flowers of one color, and then the other one becomes less common in that area because one doesn't have nectar. Okay, it's not sweet nectar. One isn't rewarding. So why would the pollinators waste their time helping the flowers when they're not getting anything in return? I hope that makes some kind of sense. I can't find an example in people, but we can revisit that in class. Then you have the disruptive selection. And so, like it thinks, like usually you think of a bell curve, nice and neat. No, now we are going to divide these 2 things down the middle, right? And why would we do that? Well, these tend to be 2 or more alleles in heterogeneous environments. Okay, so this is diversifying selection. And it's going to favor the survival of 2 or more of those phenotypes depending on the environment that they are in. And so if you consider our snails here, they can live in 2 different environments, and now in the woods or in the open fields. And now depending on if we're talking woods or open fields, it's going to tell you what the population looks like there. And like we looked at the moths, we know that certain populations favor certain things. Well, the difference between these 2 are that these are so close that they just go from one to the other. They can go from the open fields to the woods and back again, stabilizing both of them in this area. And then we have our stabilizing selection, where you start off with this wide range and over time it's narrowing it. Okay, and why would you want to do that, right? So the idea with this one is that it favors the intermediate phenotype. Okay, so the evolution, the environment favors the intermediate phenotype. So over time you lose the 2 extremes and you stabilize and narrow the middle. This is going to decrease genetic diversity, okay, because it's getting rid of the large variations that exist. Those are the different types of natural selection, okay? So remember what natural selection is, the characteristics or the requirements for it, and then the 4 different patterns. questions, comments, or concerns, let me know.